Let me re-ask the question. Did you find any statement made to you by Officer Perez that was inconsistent with the evidence your investigation revealed?
No.
With the court's permission, I would like to be able to review some of the evidence that the state presented and have the witness, Detective Stone, step down from the witness box like he did before and be able to show or identify for the jury certain photographs and what those photographs show, so that we're able to go through that, I guess, that lineup that's there with the photographs of the officers, and also to discuss State's Exhibit 17 while the witness is up here at ease. Is that okay?
The witness may step down from the witness stand.
Can everyone see? Is that all right? I'm going to stand and wait. I apologize if I use the wait. First, Detective Stone, I'd like for you to take a look at who I'm identifying. That is Officer McDaniel.
Yes.
And Officer Hernandez. Is that right?
That's correct.
And those are the two open space officers who initially arrived.
Excuse me, Judge, can we get Mr. Brennan out of the jury box, please?
I was told you did it, so
I didn't notice he was in the jury box last time.
If you could just stand on the outside of the box where you were when you, can you see from there?
not the same, but I'll try, guys, it's fine.
You could adjust the board a little bit further back. Is that better?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes.
I can't, I think I'd like that to be a little.
I was referring to Officer McDaniel and Officer Hernandez. Have I properly identified them with the green mark?
Yes.
Now, Officer McDaniel and Officer Hernandez are members of the Open Space Police, is that right?
It's part of the Albuquerque Police Department. It's a unit within, a specialized unit within the Albuquerque Police Department.
Okay. Now, what do you know about the uniforms that these officers are required to wear?
As far as the open space
Yes.
officers, they're required to wear a similar type uniform as the regular patrol officers you see. It can be modified to the where the material is different, because oftentimes they will have to ride bicycles, ride four-wheelers, so they will wear more like t-shirt style police uniforms, and maybe in the summertime police shorts or a type of biking pants.
Now, what if any concerns were raised in your mind about the way that these officers were attired or presented themselves in the course of your investigation? Did you find anything that was unusual?
No.
Okay. I'd like to talk to you about Sergeant Carpenter, Officer Weatherly, Officer Rogelio, Officer Monet, and I believe that's Officer Nitrath. Is that right?
That's correct.
So I named those officers and I pointed to them with the green marker in the correct sequence. Is that right?
From left to right, that's correct.
There are standard operating procedures with regards to the uniform that officers are required to wear. Is that right?
That's correct.
And with regard to that standard operating procedure, did you find any problems with the uniforms these officers were wearing? That is, were they consistent with the SOPs?
Yes.
Okay. Now, according to the SOPs, how should a field services officer be dressed or required to be dressed?
When they're in uniform, they're required to wear exactly what you're seeing. There's obviously a long sleeve uniform shirt and short sleeve uniform shirt, which you see Sergeant Carpenter wearing. He's wearing a short sleeve. And Christopher Weatherland is wearing, he might be wearing a shorter sleeve, but with a different type of material. And I should actually point out that Christopher Weatherland is a bicycle patrol officer, which is why his uniform looks a little bit different and probably similar to the open space officers. But to the regular field uniform, you're going to see that it's the dark slacks with the t-shirts, and they have their badge of office pinned on the left side of their breast shirt with the nameplates that are going to be on the right side. And then you're going to have the Albuquerque police patches on both shoulders. And one is going to be, one side is going to be just Albuquerque police, and then the other side, if they're in any kind of special unit like bike patrol, open space, canine, or SWAT. And then, of course, you're going to look at their duty belt, and it's hard to see because the duty belt's the same color as the uniform. But that's where they're going to have all the equipment that they need, that they're required to wear by SOP when they go on patrol, and that's going to consist of their firearm, their extra magazines, their mace, their taser, their expandable baton, and their handcuffs.
So when you say an officer is required to wear certain equipment, where does that requirement come from?
It comes from the Albuquerque Police Department's SOP.
So if, for example, Officer Wetterland did not have a handheld taser, what could be the consequence of that?
He'd be violating the SOP, and if there was an investigation, he could be reprimanded for it.
Is that one of the reasons why you may take into account, for example, why officers had certain tools with them at a particular time of the incident?
It is an aspect of the later on internal investigation. There are two parts to officer-involved shootings. There's the criminal aspect of it, which I'm in charge of as a homicide investigator, and then you have the internal affairs one. And my investigation will cover both of those.
Now I'd like to turn your attention to that officer with the sunglasses, and that's Officer Monet, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, what is that item that's in front of his person?
That's a .223 rifle.
Now, what concerns, if any, were raised during the course of your investigation that Officer Monet, as a CIT officer, had with him a .223 rifle?
Wasn't really concerning to me. I mean, he was allowed to have it, qualified with it.
So I wanted to ask this about the weapons that these officers had. Would you please explain to the jury the process that an officer has to go through to be essentially authorized by the department to have a weapon?
Well, yeah, first off, when you're going through the police academy, you're going through firearms training, and you have to pass at a minimum score a series of qualifications, and it's a numbering score starting from 100 going all the way down to 50, 40, whatever, and you have to pass at a minimum of 70% or better in order to actually pass that particular qualification. And in order to successfully pass the Albuquerque Police Department Academy, you have to pass a series of those. Now, as you go throughout your career as a police officer, every year, biannually, I believe it is, you have to pass firearms qualification at a minimum of 7% in order to continue being a police officer. And that's just for your standard duty sidearm that every police officer carries while on duty. Now, when it comes to the .223, there's actually required courses you have to go through in order to actually carry a rifle on duty. And if you do not attend those courses, and if you do not pass the qualifications with your pistol and your rifle, then you are not authorized to carry that rifle on duty.
Now, what steps does the Albuquerque Police Department take to actually review the weapon, or I guess have an armor review the weapon? How does that process work?
That process will work whenever you bring that firearm to the weapons range for the very first time, or for instance, McCall Monet, if he was going to be wanting to carry this rifle on duty and he's going through the course, he's going to take it out to the firearms range, and there is a qualified firearms armor, someone who actually specializes in inspecting firearms, can actually disassemble parts of the firearm that aren't typically disassembled at just the cleaning level. And they actually have to do an examination of the rifle to make sure it meets up with the Albuquerque Police Department standards as a weapon that can be used on the police department.
Now, I was going to turn your attention to that officer named Brock Ninrath, and am I marking him correctly with my green markers?
Yes.
And what is that item in front of him?
This is also a .223 rifle.
Now, it seems a little hard to see. Why is that? At least from my vantage point, Mike, for us. So
you'll see that when I talked about earlier how these rifles can be customized, parts can be changed out. McCall Monet's rifle has been changed out with different parts, customized pistol grip, customized buttstock, customized forward hand grips over the barrel. And his are of different color than what we typically see on the 223 when it comes from the store, which is black in color. So that's why his is standing out more than Brock Niprath's, which it appears to be more standard like you would see coming from the store.
Now, you have two CIT officers, Brock Niprath, who I'm pointing to the green pointer, and also Michael Monet, armed with 223 rifles, is that right?
That's correct.
And what concerns, if any, were raised in your investigation that you had the CIT officers having those weapons on their person when they were negotiating for this book?
Through my investigation, during the time that McCall Monet was negotiating with Boyd, I didn't see anything that really raised a concern for me.
Let me ask it in a very more direct way. Is it fair to say that based on your investigation of this case, that the fact that Officer Monet had a rifle on his person when he was speaking with and negotiating with Mr. Boyd, that it had no visible effect or audible effect on Mr. Boyd?
It didn't seem to, not with McCall Monet.
And you would agree with me that with regard to Brock Niprath and his rifle, that through your investigation, you were not able to identify any instance in which Mr. Boyd reacted negatively to the fact that Brock Niprath had the rifle that he had?
Not specifically to Brock Niprath, no.
Now I'd like to turn your attention to that third row and those officers, which I believe are state police officers, is that right?
Yes, Sergeant Christopher Ware and State Police Officer Mitch Bankston.
Now, what is it about these officers that makes them state police officers and distinguishes them from the Albuquerque Police Department?
So you'll notice that the uniform is considerably different and more, for lack of a better word, more rigid. They look a lot more not as relaxed. Not that I'm saying that these uniforms are relaxed, but anyway, I'll just point out the differences. Their uniforms actually, they are the same kind of dark blue, black in color, but they also have, as you see on the button-ups right here, the gray in the shirt with the buttons, the gray pockets, the gray sleeve, whatever you call those slashes, and the couplings on the wrists. Another noticeable difference you'll see is the actual little leather sash that they'll wear across the body, which is unique to state police officers. When it comes to the uniform, the equipment on their belt, I'm not familiar with their SOP as to what they're required to wear. However, they do wear similar type equipment as to the Albuquerque police officers. Another big thing that you will see with state police that you won't see with the Albuquerque police officers is while on duty and outside, uniformed state patrolmen will wear their actual police patrol hat, where sometimes you may see an Albuquerque police officer wearing more of like a ball style type cap, like a baseball cap. They're actually going to wear their patrolman cap, and that's unique to the state police.
Now, you had mentioned, I guess, the SOP requiring certain equipment. One of the questions you were asked during your direct examination was with regards to ammunition. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you would agree with me that the Albuquerque Police Department has procedures in place that specify the type and kind of ammunition a police officer can use. Is that right?
Yes, they're actually, Albuquerque Police Department will actually issue you your duty ammunition. And what I mean by duty ammunition is it is the only ammunition that you can carry in your rifle or your pistol, the only authorized ammunition that you can carry. Obviously, these firearms will fire other types of ammunition. However, the Albuquerque Police Department does not allow it.
Now, during the course of your investigation, did you find that any officer had in his possession ammunition that was in violation of the SOP, or that is, that did not conform with what the SOP required?
Yes, I did.
Okay, who was that?
That was Officer McCollum.
Now, with regard to Officer Perez, in your investigation, did you find that Officer Perez had ammunition that wasn't authorized for use by the Albuquerque Police Department?
I don't believe so.
Now, with regard to Detective Sandy, did you find that Officer Sandy had in his possession any ammunition that wasn't authorized by the Albuquerque Police Department?
Not that I recall, I don't believe so.
Now, with regard to Officer Monet, who I'm pointing to with the green marker, it's fair to say he never used his firearm, is that right?
That's correct.
So whatever ammunition he didn't or had or didn't have, it doesn't really matter because he did not actually fire. Is that fair to say?
As far as my investigation goes, I was not concerned with the ammunition that he had.
Now I'd like to turn your attention to the bottom row. And again, there's the one that you're in front of right now. I think that's Anthony Sedler.
Yes, SWAT Officer Anthony Sedler.
Now, he has a particular type of uniform. Will you please explain what that uniform is?
Yes, again, so Albuquerque police SWAT officers, again, are going to be distinguished from any other type of police officers. And that's for several reasons. Because of the type of job that they do and the inherent risk that they go into with dealing with barricaded subjects, armed barricaded subjects, or someone who may be like an active shooter in a school or something like that. They will be dressed a certain way, so they are very, very readily identifiable as Albuquerque police SWAT officers. And that's going to be unique to their green uniform. And they actually wear kind of, if you've ever seen like an Air Force pilot wear kind of like a jumpsuit, they wear the same type of jumpsuit when they get dressed out to go on SWAT calls. And that's kind of what you'll see underneath all the tactical gear that they have on them. And also where a patrolman is just going to have a bulletproof vest underneath his shirt, which is a vest that every officer is issued from property when they become police officers. In addition to that, SWAT officers are going to be issued ballistic plates, which again, as I mentioned, adds a higher layer of protection than just the woven Kevlar of the patrolman. And that will be inside the actual vest plate, the vest that they have on. And where patrolmen will typically, they will have all their tools on their belt, like their gun and their magazines, their handcuffs, they'll all be on the belt on their pants. When you look at the SWAT officers, in addition to having that on their belt and a drop-down holster for their pistol, they're going to have a lot of gear on their chest rig for the purposes of they actually have to bring a lot more tools to an incident. You have breaching tools, different types of breaching guns, different types of less lethal munitions. So it's a lot of stuff they have to carry. So the reason they carry stuff on their chest rig is so it's easily accessible.
So I wanted to turn your attention to the photo that's sort of behind it. That's, I believe, a SWAT officer of McFarland, is that right?
Yes, it is.
And his attire is pretty much the same, is that right, as Officer Sedler?
Yes, it's a little modified. Obviously, he's not in the jumpsuit. Like if I turn your attention to K9 Officer Kenneth
Ronzone, is that?
Kenneth Ronzone, thank you. He has on the jumpsuit that I just explained. He's kind of in a modified uniform, I presume because it was a Sunday. But he does have on the same type of equipment. And in addition to that, he actually has his ballistic helmet on.
I'd like to turn your attention, again, this is K9 Officer Ronzone, is that right?
That's correct.
And I'm also pointing right now to K9 Officer Scott Weimerskirch, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, again, and maybe the photograph obscures it, so I want to be real clear, so I could ask you to remove the photograph for the moment, and we'll put it back on as soon as we're done. At least we'll endeavor to do so. Good job, good job. With regard to Exhibit 34A, which is a photograph of Officer Scott Weimerskirch, is it fair to say that Scott Weimerskirch is dressed or attired the same way he was dressed and attired during the incident in which Mr. Bush?
Yes, he's not in the actual jumpsuit that I had spoken about earlier, but he is in another type of tactical uniform that they do have.
And there are SOPs with regard to tactical uniforms, is that right?
That's correct.
So there's a prescribed uniform, and that is an authorized uniform for tactical team members, SWAT team members.
That's correct.
Now, I wanted to point out what isn't here. You would agree with me that what Scott Weimerskirch did not have on his person was these so-called, these plates that go into your, I guess it would be the vest.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That Scott Weimerskirch was not wearing those plates. That's correct?
No.
Now, there is an SOP that requires officers to wear soft body. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in the academy, officers are given a class on what soft body armor can do and what it can't do. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Now, with regard to soft body armor, you would agree with me that it's essentially Kevlar, a Kevlar weave that helps to dissipate the energy created, or energy, the energy that's impact, that bullet impact causes. That's correct. There's no such thing as, body armor is not bulletproof, you would agree with that?
No, it's not.
In fact, rifle rounds can easily penetrate body armor.
Rifle rounds can easily penetrate the soft body armor that police officers wear.
And you would agree with me that soft body armor is not a protection against an edge weapon?
Not always, no.
There are things called stab vests, is that right?
I've heard of them, yes.
Right, they're like chainmail. That's what's effective against edge weapons. Have you heard about that?
Not really.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. Are officers trained in the academy that soft body armor is not adequate protection against edge weapons?
Yes, we are.
And you all are taught that in the academy?
Yes.
Now, let's turn your attention to the other SWAT officer, and then we'll reach the rope officers. You see Officer Perdue, the one I'm identifying with my green marker?
That's correct.
Now, again, in your experience, again, Ms. McGinn, or the state brought out that you have a certain amount of military experience. And I want to explore that a little further because I think you can speak to this in much more depth because of your actual experience. I understand that you successfully completed the United States Army Ranger School.
Correct.
And that you were in Army reconnaissance. You were an Army scout.
I was in reconnaissance.
And so, again, if I'm using scouting correctly, I apologize. Now, in reconnaissance work, you go out in small units, is that right?
That's correct.
And with those units, and if I remember the Army terminology correctly, that Army snipers are actually marksmen, is that right?
Yes.
So you have a great familiarity with how marksmen work in the United States Army and the importance, or I should say, how a weapon is actually used by a marksman.
Yes.
And you've also, of course, had an opportunity to see how the Albuquerque Police Department uses its snipers, is that right?
Yes, I have.
So you would agree with me that a firearm, such as the one that Officer Perdue has two purposes. It's both a firearm and a tool from which to make observations, is that correct?
That is correct.
Would you please explain how that works, how a firearm can also be a tool for observation?
Again, because of the advanced optic scope that he has on his sniper rifle, he can see a pretty incredible distance as opposed to just the naked eye or even, say, the smaller magnified optics that the SWAT officers have, like the swivel one that we talked about. So it's going to allow you to see a greater distance. And in my experience, the SWAT snipers, which we refer to as high ground, the majority of the time, they are actually used as an observation post. And what they will do is they will set up as best they can in an area to oversee the objective or the threat area so they can provide information to the officers who are on the ground and closer to the threat. And they do that by looking through their scope. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be shooting right then and there, but they are utilizing the scope for that purpose.
Now, turning your attention to Officer Perdue's uniform, or I should say, well, let's just be clear, that is a form of camouflage, is that right?
That is correct. That is one of the important things that high ground must do, or a sniper must do. He must, the purpose is to be in an area and not be seen. So the reason he was dressed like this is because he was out in the open space area, which you can see from the picture is year-round typically what the color of that area is. So he will dress accordingly to try and match his environment.
Now, focusing your attention to this individual, I believe that's Officer Perez, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Now, in your investigation, did you come across any concerns with regard to the way he was attired, the equipment that he had on his person, or anything like that?
No.
I'd like to turn your attention to a new exhibit, and that states Exhibit 17. Now, during the course of your investigation, would it be fair to say that you had an opportunity to review the interviews of every one of the 19 officers who are identified on State's Exhibit 17?
Yes, I did.
And from those interviews, you were able to determine whether or not the officers were able to see Mr. Boyd or see the officer involved shooting of Mr. Boyd. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So let's begin with the top. I believe I'm pointing to Officer Rogelio and Officer McFarland.
That's correct.
Those two officers, based on your review, based on your investigation in this case, were those officers in a position where they could see the officer involved shooting of James Boyd?
No, they were more in an area where they could hear.
Okay. So those officers McFarland and Officer Rogelio, were simply not in a position to respond or react when the incident occurred involving the shooting of James Boyd.
That's correct.
I'm going to turn your attention to this officer who's off here, M. Bankston, that's State Police Officer Bankston.
Yeah, although the names are kind of spread apart, they were all kind of together in one group, so they weren't really spread out.
So let me rephrase that. You had Officer Niprak, Officer Sedler, and Officer Ronzone, and Officer Bankston in the same area. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Now, based on your review, or based on your investigation in this case, what, if anything, could those officers see regarding the officer involved shooting of James Boyd?
They were not actually, because they were at a lower elevation on the other side of this little hill, an encampment, they were not able to see anything that transpired over here. The only thing that they could hear is when the arrest was being taken place and then the shooting occurred.
So to be crystal clear, I'm drawing an imaginary line with the green marker. Is it your testimony that there is a difference in elevation between the location of Mr. Boyd and the officers, Bankston, Niprath, Sedler, and Renzo?
Yes, well, and I've been up there numerous times, where James Boyd and the camp was located in this particular area. It's kind of the peak of this little tiny hill right here before it starts to go back up again. So you have to go up to get to James Boyd and the camp. And then from the side where Anthony Sedler, Ronzone, Niprath, and Bankston were, you start to go back down and around some boulders.
So those officers could not see the officer involved, I should say Officers Bankston, Sedler, Ronzone, and Niprath could not see the officer involved shooting of James Boyd because there was a hill in between them and the incident.
Yes.
Let me turn your attention now to Officer Ornalis. Based on your investigation, was Officer Ornalis able to see the officer involved shooting of James Boyd?
No, because there was a point where when the shooting occurred, he had actually gone back to get the beanbag shotgun. So it was somewhere between the house and here where Ornalis was. So as far as exactly where he was, I'm not exactly sure.
But it's clear that Officer Ornalis did not see the officer involved shooting.
I don't believe so.
And you would agree with me that Officer Ornalis was not in a place where he could react or respond to the officer involved shooting?
No, that was not.
And that's the same that could be said about these four officers, Ronzone, Sedler, Niprath, and Bankston. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, they simply could not react or respond to Mr. Boyd because they couldn't see him.
Correct.
I'd like to turn your attention to Officer Wetterlin. Based on your investigation, is it fair to say that Officer Wetterlin did not witness the officer involved shooting of James Boyd?
That's correct.
And you would agree with me that there are numerous obstacles, if you want to call them that, rocks, trees, that prevented a clear line of sight between Officer Weatherman and Mr. Boyd's location.
That's correct.
Turning your attention to the officers down below. Officers Monet, Ware, and Carpenter, do you see that?
Yes.
Based on your investigation, what did you learn about their ability to see the shooting of James Boyd?
I don't recall if they could actually see the entire thing, but again, they were pretty far down the hill at this main trail.
Do you recall any of those three officers ever saying, "I saw this happen," with regard to the officer involved shooting of James Boyd?
Not that I can recall.
Turning your attention now to officers, I believe it's McDaniel and Hernandez. Do you see that?
Yes.
What did your investigation reveal about whether those officers could see the officer involved shooting of James Boyd?
I don't recall that they were able to see the shooting.
Now, turning your attention to James Perdue, the SWAT team sniper, do you see that?
Yes.
Now, what did your investigation reveal as to whether Officer Perdue could actually see the officer involved shooting of James Boyd?
He was in a position where he could see a certain portion of when the actual arrest started, the effect of the arrest started up to the point of the shooting. I don't recall if he saw the actual shooting itself, but he was in an area where he could see portions of it and some of it.
Do you recall listening to the radio dispatch tapes and learning what Officer Perdue had done before the shooting happened with regard to his ability to continue to cover the officers with his rifle?
Yes.
What did you learn from your review of the dispatch tapes?
So there was a point where Detective Pete Sandy, Detective Rick Ingram, and Detective Weinberskirch were not really in this higher elevated position to James Boyd. There was a time where they were a little bit further west down near these rocks down here. While they were down here at this lower elevation part further to the west, SWAT sniper Jim Perdue was actually able to provide cover on James Boyd because he did not have any obstacles in the way as far as crossfire. And what I mean by crossfire is if I'm providing coverage on somebody who is a threat for some other officers, if another person gets in my line of fire, then I can no longer protect that officer. I no longer have a shot, so to speak. So there is a transmission over the radio where that is relayed when Detective Sandy, Detective Weinberskirch, and Detective Ingram move up to their final position before they try to effect the arrest and prior to the shooting, that they have now placed themselves in a position where they are in Jim Perdue's line of fire, so he can no longer provide any type of cover for them. At this point in time, he is now basically just an observer.
So is it fair to say, based on your investigation, that the only officers who were in a position to react or respond to James Boyd at the time of the officer involved shooting was Acting Sergeant Rick Ingram, Officer Scott Weinberskirch, Detective Keith Sandy, and Officer Dominique Perez?
Correct.
May the witness retake his seat.
Yes.
She's gonna need to switch it to prosecution table. Okay. As long as that's it.
I'm going to show you what's been marked State's Exhibit 15.
Yes.
Now, where was this photograph taken?
Chairman, I'm going to object to approach.
That's okay.
Do you know when this photograph was taken, State's Exhibit 15?
I don't.
You would agree with me that Mr. Boyd is a much older man than the man who's shown in State's Exhibit 15?
Yes.
And with the court's permission, I would like to switch the monitor to the prosecution table.
Yeah, they've assigned us the prosecution table.
Right, I think that was about, did you want it under VGA?
Yes, please, thank you.
Did that work?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor.
I'd like to turn your attention to the subject of computer-aided dispatch reports. Now, during your investigation in this case, you requested a number of documents from within the organization, which is the Albuquerque Police Department. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, one of the documents that you requested during the course of your investigation is known as a computer-aided dispatch report for the incident involving James Boyd. Is that right?
That is correct.
Now, the document is actually called the Detailed History for Police Call, number P140750695. Does that seem accurate to you?
Yes.
Now, what is that number actually?
That particular number identifies the CAD itself. It's unique to the call that, because Alexander Thixton had made a 242 cops call, not necessarily a 911 call. So when he made that call and requested officers out to his house or to the area, it's what we call a call for service, and then that computer-aided dispatch is created, and that number uniquely identifies that particular call.
I'm going to, with the court's permission, I'd like to hand the witness what has been marked State's Exhibit, or I should say State's Exhibit, Officer Perez's Exhibit A.
You may approach.
Detective Stone, I'm handing you what's marked Officer Perez's Exhibit A. I'd like for you to take a moment to review it, and once you have done so, please let me know.
Okay.
Is it correct to say that what has been handed to you, Exhibit A, is the CAD report for the officer-involved shooting, or I should say the incident which ended up becoming the officer-involved shooting of James Boyd?
Yes.
Now, as a preliminary matter, and this is about laying a little bit of foundation for how this document was created, would you please explain how Albuquerque Police Department radio transmissions become the statements which make up the CAD report?
Yes. So whenever a 911 call taker takes a call and someone is requesting assistance, they immediately start putting information into their computer. And that is what begins the computer assisted dispatch. Once that 911 operator gets an address or an area of the city where that person is or where that person needs officers, that 911 dispatcher will then send it to the appropriate area command dispatcher, and this is all done by computers. Once that is done, that dispatcher then will either, usually over the radio, dispatch those officers, and then via technology and however all that stuff's done, we'll send the CAD report to the officers' cars on their computer, and then that's what starts the running log and all the information that I had I told you earlier about, and it will just continue to be a running log until the conclusion of the incident.
How frequently have you used a CAD when you were a patrol officer and responded for calls to service?
As a patrol officer, you use CADs on a daily basis. I mean, if you take 20 calls for service in a day, then you're dealing with 20 CADs, 20 different CADs, 20 different CAD numbers. If you're dealing with, say you did 10 traffic stops in a day, then that will be 10 different CADs. So if you took 20 calls for service and say did 10 traffic stops, then that's 30 different CADs that were sent to your computer in one day.
Now, is it fair to say that Albuquerque Police Department officers, to the best of your knowledge, rely upon CAD reports to learn the history of a call before they arrive to a call?
Yes.
And is that something you did as a field officer when you respond to calls for service?
Yes.
Now, during your investigation of this matter, you interviewed Officer Perez, is that right?
Yes.
And during that interview, isn't it true that you learned that Officer
Excuse me,
Perez...
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I think this is hearsay.
Do you need to approach? If you want to respond, I'll make you.